On a Tuesday evening in November, a woman named Ruth Calloway set a cardboard box down at a bus stop on S.E. Hawthorne Boulevard in Portland, Oregon, and sat beside it on the cold metal bench. She was 67 years old. She had $214 in her checking account. She had a suitcase at her feet and 31 years of a life inside a building she was no longer allowed to enter. The man already sitting at the bench looked up when the box landed. He did not offer advice. He did not look at his phone. He looked at the box, and then at her, the way people look when they are actually paying attention. Nobody at that bus stop knew who he was. He had been there for 2 hours already, waiting for a friend to arrive with a replacement clutch cable for the motorcycle parked at the curb behind them, its rear tire resting on a piece of cardboard so it would not mark the pavement. He had stopped expecting the cable about 90 minutes in. By the time Ruth sat down, the motorcycle was beside the point. He would stay for another 3 hours, and what happened at the end of the third hour was the thing that Dennis Haverford would spend the next 3 years trying to explain. Not what went wrong, but why it had taken a man sitting at a bus stop in the rain to make him ask himself a question he could not answer. There is a bus stop on S.E. Hawthorne Boulevard at the corner of 34th Avenue in Portland, Oregon. It is a utilitarian kind of place. A metal bench, a plexiglass panel on 2 sides, a trash can with a lid that never quite closes. The 14 bus runs every 18 minutes in the evening. A coffee shop sits 15 feet to the left, a pharmacy to the right, and directly across the street, behind a plywood construction barrier with a rendering of what is coming, is the building where Ruth Calloway had lived since 1993. It was called the Carmichael Arms. 7 stories, 44 units, red brick gone soft with 3 decades of Portland rain. Ruth had moved in when her youngest was 3 years old. She paid $412 a month then. By the time she left, she was paying $683. Both of those numbers matter. The rendering on the plywood barrier showed something called Carmichael Commons. 14-foot ceilings, herringbone oak floors, a rooftop terrace, studio units starting at $2,250 a month, 1 bedrooms at $3,100. The rendering had people in it, young, effortless looking, holding coffee cups in the specific way people do in renderings. Ruth's name was not in the rendering, neither were the other 31 tenants who had received 60-day notices in September. She had carried 3 things from her apartment when she left: a cardboard box holding the framed photograph of her husband Gerald, who had died in 2018, a binder of handwritten recipes with tabs she had made herself from masking tape, and a Sharpie, and a small rubber tree in a terracotta pot that had been on her windowsill since 2004. The rubber tree did not fit in the box. It was sitting at her feet on the wet pavement when she sat down. The man on the bench looked at the rubber tree for a moment. Then he slid to the far end of the bench to make room. He did not say anything. He just moved. Dennis Haverford had been in Portland real estate for 26 years. He was 53, lean in the way of men who keep a disciplined schedule not for health, but because discipline itself has become the point. He drove a dark blue Range Rover. He wore the same 3 colors, navy, gray, charcoal, because he had read once that successful people eliminate trivial decisions, and he had found this useful and had applied it broadly. His office was in the Pearl District, 4 miles and several tax brackets from the Carmichael Arms. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a 12-seat conference table, a wall where he had installed, without irony, an aerial photograph of every property he had acquired and converted. The Carmichael Arms was the 13th. The frame was not yet on the wall. He had acquired the property for $8.7 million in July. He expected to recoup that figure in 18 months. He was not unusual in this. He was not, by the standards of his industry, even aggressive. What his office wall did not show, what almost nothing about Dennis Haverford showed, by design, was Medford, Oregon, in 1983. A manufactured home on a gravel lot off Highway 99. His father's work boots by the door at 5 a.m. The same pair for 4 years running, because new boots were not a decision that got made easily. His mother's second job, cleaning guest rooms at the Hampton Inn off the interstate. A job she did not tell the neighbors about, because she had her reasons. Dennis remembered, with a clarity that 43 years of forward motion had not softened, the specific weight of wearing clothes that were almost the right size, of being invited to things and quietly calculating whether he could afford to go, of understanding class not as an abstraction, but as a kind of weather. You were inside it or outside it, and there was no gradation between. He remembered every person on that street in Medford by name. He did not think about it anymore. Or rather, he thought about it only in the way that makes you move faster, the way that converts memory into acceleration. He had built $41 million in property value. He had acquired. He had converted. He had filed the necessary notices, which were compliant with Oregon law. And he had moved forward, and he told himself the story in terms of vision and risk and the logic of markets. He did not spend time on the version of the story in which 31 households packed what they could and worked out where to go. On the night of November 19th, Dennis had a 7:30 call with his contractor about the rooftop terrace timeline. After that, he was going to drive by the Carmichael Arms for a site check before heading home. He had done everything correctly. He was certain of this. Ruth had not planned to talk to the man on the bench. She was not in the mood for conversation. She was in the mood for her apartment and a cup of tea and a rubber tree on the windowsill, and all of those things were gone, which is a particular kind of not in the mood that does not have a word for it. But he did not say anything for a while, and the silence was different from the silence of someone waiting for you to leave. It was the other kind. After about 10 minutes, she said, "That is a very ordinary hoodie for a Tuesday evening." He looked down at it. "I have had it for a long time." "That makes sense." Another pause. The 14 bus went by without stopping. "Are you moving?" He was looking at the box, the suitcase, the rubber tree. "I was moved," she said. And because that phrase had a precision she had not found before she said it again, quietly, to herself. "I was moved." He looked at her then. Not at the box, not at the rubber tree. At her. She told him. Not all at once. It came out the way things come out at a bus stop in November when you are 67 and you have nowhere to be, in pieces, with pauses, with the occasional circling back. The 60-day notice in September. The real estate company's name. The open house they had held in her building before the notice arrived. People in blazers walking through her hallway, photographing the light through her windows. Gerald dying in 2018. The 31 years. The $683. He listened through all of it. He asked one question, about halfway through. "Did anyone from the company come talk to you directly?" Not a letter. Someone in person. She thought about it. A woman came with a packet once. She had business cards. What did the packet say? It had a list of resources and a number you could call. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She was very polite. He nodded. He did not say anything about what he was thinking. At 7:52, a dark blue Range Rover pulled to the curb directly across the street, between the construction barrier and the Carmichael Arms' front entrance. The entrance still had its original brass lettering above the door, Carmichael Arms, installed in 1961. Those letters were scheduled to come down in the first week of January. The man on the bench looked at the car. At the license plate frame, Haverford Development Group, Pearl District, Portland. He looked at the person who got out. Navy overcoat, no hat, a phone in one hand, keys in the other. He looked back at Ruth. Does the name Haverford mean anything to you? Ruth looked at the car. Something moved through her face. That is the man who owns the building now. He sat with that for a moment. Then, will you be all right here for a few minutes? She looked at him in the specific way of someone who is 67, who has been through things, and who can see when something is about to happen. Go ahead, she said. He crossed S.E. Hawthorne in the rain, hands in his hoodie pockets. Unhurried, Dennis Haverford was at the construction barrier, making notes on his phone. He did not look up when footsteps approached. He was a man accustomed to waiting for others to announce themselves. Mr. Haverford, he looked up. A man in a gray hoodie and worn boots, wet from the rain. No briefcase, no clipboard. Standing alone, Dennis Haverford had the particular social radar of someone who had spent 26 years reading rooms, evaluating who matters, where the power is, what merits his attention. Everything about the person in front of him registered as, not this conversation. He turned back to his phone. I am sorry, this is a private site. I know. I was sitting at the bus stop across the street. A pause. I have been talking to Ruth Calloway. Dennis looked up again, this time with more care. I know who that is. She has been in that building for 31 years, the man said. She was paying $683 a month. She received 60 days. Dennis put his phone in his pocket. He had had this conversation before with a housing advocate who had stood outside his office on 2 separate Thursdays, with a city council member who had called his personal cell. He had a version of the response that was accurate and concise and left no real opening. Our notice period was in full compliance with Oregon law. The tenants received access to relocation resources. Our legal obligation was met in full. That is not what I asked. Dennis looked at him. What did you ask? I asked if 60 days was enough, quiet, conversational, for someone who has been somewhere for 31 years. That is a policy question, not a business question. I operate within the policy. He turned back toward the barrier. I am going to have to ask you to head back across the street. 2 construction workers near the building entrance had stopped. They were watching with the particular stillness of people pretending to do something else. The man in the hoodie did not move. She has a rubber tree, he said. She has been growing it since 2004. She carried it out in her arms because it did not fit in the box. She is sitting at that bus stop in the rain right now, and she does not know where she is sleeping tonight. She told me she has $214 in her account. She said it the way people say a number they have been staring at all day, because it is the number that determines everything. Dennis Haverford turned. Something was happening in his expression that was not supposed to happen in conversations like this one. Mister, he stopped. He did not know the man's name. That building, a gesture toward the Carmichael Arms, toward the brass letters still above the door. How many of the 44 units have been occupied for more than 20 years? Dennis opened his mouth. Nothing came out. One of the construction workers, a young man named Paulo, 23, who had been on a ladder at the far end of the site and had climbed down at some point without quite deciding to, was standing at the edge of the barrier now. He was listening. A woman in a tan coat was also watching. She had been walking east along Hawthorne, had slowed without quite stopping, her face turned slightly sideways the way people turn when they are trying to hear something without appearing to. She was perhaps 30 yards away. She did not leave. The rain came down. A bus went by. No one at the stop across the street moved to flag it. "I did not come over here to ruin your evening," the man said. "I came because a woman is sitting at a bus stop in November with a plant in a box, and she does not know where she is sleeping tonight. I thought you ought to know what that looks like from 20 feet away." Dennis looked across the street. At the bench, at the shape of Ruth Calloway in the dark, the rubber tree beside her feet. He stood like that for a long moment. Then, "Come inside." The Carmichael Arms lobby was mid-gutting, bare concrete where the tile had been, electrical cables looping from open walls, a folding table with blueprints and the morning's coffee cups. But the original mailboxes were still on the wall near the entrance. 44 of them. Brushed brass with small rectangular name slots. Some still held the cards, handwritten, typed, a few printed with tape. The renovations had not reached that wall yet. Dennis stood in front of the mailboxes. He had been in this lobby a dozen times since July. He had not, until this moment, looked at the name cards. He turned. "Who are you?" Someone who was waiting for a clutch cable and lost track of time. Dennis made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He looked at the blueprints on the folding table. Then, away. "You want me to feel something. You are already feeling something. That is why we are in here instead of out there." Dennis put his hands in his coat pockets. His eyes went back to the mailboxes. To the card in slot 4C. R. Calloway. He told the story the way people tell it when they have not told it recently, in a flat, fast voice, as if the speed makes it cost less. The gravel lot, the boots his father wore until they failed. The Hampton Inn. The specific shame of clothes that were almost the right size. 26 years of building something and not looking back. "I did not get here by waiting for people to make room," he said. "I got here by making my own room." The man across from him was quiet for a moment. "I know what it is to walk into rooms and wait for the moment someone figures out you don't belong," he said finally. "There were years I was trying to prove something to people who weren't paying attention, trying to earn something I was already owed." He paused. "And I know what happens when you spend long enough trying to get through a door. You can forget the door was the problem, not you. And without quite deciding to, you end up standing on the other side of it, doing the same thing that was done to you. Not because you planned it. Because the protection became the habit." Dennis did not answer. "Ruth's husband died 6 years ago. She told me that in the first 10 minutes. Not as background information, but as the fact that organized everything else. She stayed in that building, and that building was the last place she was Ruth and Gerald, instead of just Ruth." He let that sit. "You cannot give her that back. I understand that. That is not what I am asking." He stood. "I am asking what you can do, specifically, not in a packet, not in a phone number, for the people whose names are still in that wall." He put his hand briefly on the corner of the folding table. Then he walked toward the lobby door. At the entrance he stopped, turned back once. "I did not tell you my name. You did not ask, which I think says something." A pause. "There is a woman across the street in the rain. She has nowhere to sleep tonight. Whatever you decide to do next, start with her." He walked out through the lobby door and crossed Hawthorne in the rain. Ruth was where he had left her, rubber tree between her feet, eyes on the building. He sat back down at the far end of the bench, wet from the crossing. "Did you eat today?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. Lunch, he looked at the coffee shop 15 feet to their left, warm light through the window. "Still open, come on." They took a table near the back. Ruth ordered the soup. He ordered coffee and did not touch it. She was talking about Gerald, not about the building or the notice or the $214, but about Gerald specifically. The way he laughed at his own jokes before he finished them. The way he pronounced the word particularly with an extra syllable that he seemed unaware of. The trip they took to Astoria in 2011, and the specific argument they had about directions that they had both found funny within 10 minutes. He asked questions that were about Gerald, not about the situation. What did he do? What was he good at? What was the thing he always said? She was still talking when the door opened at 9:17 and Dennis Haverford walked in. Navy overcoat, no hat. He stood in the entrance for a moment, adjusting to the light and warmth. He saw the table. He saw the man in the gray hoodie. He registered something on his face that he did not have time to compose before Ruth looked up. He walked to the table. He stood in front of it. He looked at the soup, at her hands wrapped around the bowl, at the rubber tree she had set on the chair beside her. Mrs. Calloway. His voice was careful and stripped of performance. My name is Dennis Haverford. I am the owner of the Carmichael Arms. He stopped. Your former building. I am sorry, that is the accurate phrase, and it is a bad one. He looked at the table. What I did was legal. I am not going to sit here and tell you it wasn't, but legal and sufficient are not the same thing, and I knew that when I filed the notices. And I filed them anyway. He looked directly at her. I would like to do something specific about that tonight, if you will let me tell you what I have in mind. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked across the table, at the man in the gray hoodie who was looking at his coffee cup, giving her the space to make this decision without his face in it. She turned back to Dennis Haverford. Sit down, she said. Tell me what you have in mind. He told her. It had specific numbers in it. A specific timeline. When he finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. That would help, she said. That would genuinely help. Dennis nodded. He set his card on the table and said someone from his office would call in the morning to handle the paperwork. Then he put on his hat and walked out. Ruth looked at the card for a moment. She looked at the man across the table from her. Who are you? She said. He smiled. The real one, slightly crooked. Nothing manufactured about it. Someone who needed a clutch cable. She looked at him the way you look at someone when the shape of them is clarifying into something you almost recognize. A look that held for a moment and then let go. Thank you, she said, for moving to the end of the bench. He said, you would have done the same thing. She considered it honestly. I would like to think so. He paid the check when it came, the soup, the coffee, a piece of pie Ruth had ordered halfway through the second hour without quite meaning to. He left cash on the table, folded, the way you leave it when you don't want to make it a moment. He held the door for her on the way out. They stood on the sidewalk in the cold for a moment. A taxi went by. Somewhere up the block, the 14 bus was approaching its stop. Do you have somewhere tonight? He asked. I am going to call my daughter, she said. I should have called her earlier. I think I was not ready to say it out loud yet. She looked at the building across the street, at the brass letters above the door, visible even through the rain. I am ready now. He watched her make the call from the sidewalk. When her daughter picked up and Ruth began to speak, he walked back to his motorcycle. He fastened the helmet, started the engine, and pulled into traffic heading north. Nobody on Hawthorne Avenue looked twice. The conversation between Dennis Haverford and his attorney on Wednesday morning lasted 47 minutes. The conversation with his project manager lasted 20 minutes and involved a spreadsheet that was revised 4 times. By Friday of that week, his office had sourced transitional housing assistance for 21 of the 31 displaced Carmichael Arms tenants. Not a packet, not a phone number, but a caseworker, and a specific dollar amount and a signed commitment. The remaining 10 had made other arrangements in the preceding weeks. His office called each of them anyway. Ruth Calloway moved into a one-bedroom on S.E. Belmont Street on December 3rd. First month and deposit covered. Her rubber tree went on the windowsill, west-facing, the kind of light that rubber trees prefer. It was not the Carmichael Arms. It was not Gerald's building. Nothing was going to be that again. But the light in the afternoons came through at an angle that reminded her of something, and she kept the recipe binder on the counter where she could reach it without having to look. Dennis Haverford acquired 2 more properties in the months that followed, and he filed notices on both, and neither set of tenants received immediately what the Carmichael Arms tenants had received. But something had changed in the calculation. He added a line item to his acquisition model that his team did not initially understand: tenant transition support, itemized with a specific per-unit amount scaled by years of tenancy. When asked where the number came from, he said he had revised his thinking on carrying costs. He did not explain further. His analyst at the time, a young woman named Claire, 26, who had been working out the ethics of her own position for the better part of a year, looked at the line item and then at Dennis Haverford and then back at the line item. She did not ask again. But she had been passing along Hawthorne on the night of November 19th, walking home. And she had slowed at the construction barrier and watched a man in a gray hoodie ask a question that a man in a navy overcoat could not answer. She had not been able to name what she was watching at the time. She had thought about it on the walk home. She had been thinking about it since. 3 months after Dennis added the line item, Claire resigned from Haverford Development. She joined a housing policy nonprofit in N.E. Portland. In her first month, she published a report detailing per-unit tenant displacement costs versus per-unit renovation margins for 8 Portland properties across 5 years. The numbers were specific. The company names were in it. The report was read by 4 city council members, 2 investigative journalists, and a quantity of ordinary people who forwarded it without comment, in the way you forward something when the document already says everything the email would have said. A revised tenant protection amendment moved through a city committee 6 months later. It did not pass. But it was closer than it had been. And the people who had been pushing for it for 3 years said the report was part of the reason it was close. Paolo, the construction worker who had climbed down off his ladder on November 19th and stood at the edge of the site listening, finished the Carmichael Commons renovation in February. He did good work throughout, because he was good at his work and because the work itself and the thing it served are separate things. But he did not sign on to the next Haverford project. He signed on to a mixed-income development in North Portland, run by a nonprofit builder. Less money, slower timeline, site meetings that included community input sessions held in the church across the street. He was the youngest crew member by 11 years. He found he liked it more than he expected to. The brass letters came down from the Carmichael Arms on January 9th, as scheduled. Dennis had them crated and shipped to a storage facility rather than salvage. He was not entirely certain why he made that call. He told himself it was because they had historical value. That may have been part of it. In the spring, in a feature interview about Portland's tenant protection movement, Claire was asked what had changed her thinking. She named a lot of things: the data, the reports, the specific faces of specific people at specific moments. But she also said this, that she had once watched a man in a gray hoodie cross a rain-wet street with his hands in his pockets and walk up to someone twice his professional weight and ask a question the other man could not answer. She said she had been 30 yards away and could not hear the whole conversation. She said she had never found out who the man in the hoodie was. She said the question he asked was not a complicated question. How many of those units have been occupied for more than 20 years? She said the person who could not answer it was not a monster. She said that was the part she kept returning to. I keep coming back to the bench. Not the confrontation, not the paperwork or the line item or the report Claire published. I keep coming back to the bench, and to the specific act of sliding to the far end of it when a woman set a cardboard box down. Because that was the first thing, before any of the rest. A man who could have looked at his phone or waited on the other side of the stop made 6 inches of room and did not say anything about it. And that was enough for Ruth to put the box down and stay. I think about the 3 seconds that cost him, the zero inconvenience of it. And I think about how much of what came afterward. The conversation, the crossing, the lobby, the coffee shop, the phone call Ruth finally made to her daughter would not have happened if he had just stayed where he was. I do not know how to make a lesson out of that. I am not sure it is a lesson. It might just be a fact about how things start, that most of the ones that matter begin with something that looked too small to count. I also think about Dennis Haverford standing in front of 44 mailboxes at 9 p.m., reading name cards he had walked past a dozen times without seeing. And the long distance between Medford in 1983 and a lobby in Portland in November, and the specific cost of arriving somewhere after a very long trip and realizing you left something on the road that you needed. I do not know if he became the version of himself he was capable of being. I hope so. Not confident. Hope, the kind that knows it might be wrong and shows up anyway. This story is fictional, inspired by Keanu Reeves' well-known reputation for sitting with strangers and listening without agenda. Drop a comment, not about what you thought of the story, but about the last time you moved to the end of the bench. Those moments are worth naming out loud. If this one landed for someone you know, send it to them. I think you probably already know who. Subscribe if you are here for more stories like this one. See you in the next one.